So as I'm talking about fantasy a lot, it seems like there's a lot of times that I run into religious people that have a huge problem with fantasy, and they seem to think that it's evil. And in reading it, you're somehow welcoming demons into the house. There's more fantasy books that are singled out, which are kind of silly to me, that, from Christian authors such as Harry Potter, and there's more specific ones that are singled out than all of them generally. But some of the ones that are singled out are ones that were actually written by Christians. Like for instance, Harry Potter, which was written by J.K. Rowling, who's a Christian. Now, even if she wasn't a Christian, I still don't think that it would be wrong to read fantasy books, including Harry Potter and other ones. Right off the out of the gate, when I say something like that, I face a lot of blowback from some religious people, and it seems like some people just they want to be more holy than God, in the sense that they want to disallow and stop things in books that are even in the Bible. And I don't really know exactly how to address this, because pretty much, if you have made up your mind that fantasy is evil, there's not much I can say to convince you otherwise. And if you've made up your mind that fantasy is great and perfect in every way, then there's not much I can say to convince you. I will say this, that if you are somebody who loves fantasy, but there's just a lot of blowback from religious people, don't read it around them, and just don't talk about it around them, and then it just won't even be an issue. Just let it go. You know what I mean? And if you're someone who feels convicted about fantasy, I'll say, don't read it then. But that also doesn't mean that you don't have to try, that you have to somehow try to convict everyone else around you. Like, if you feel convicted about fantasy, that's fine. Don't read it and just move on, and that's fine. Like, live by your convictions, that's fine. But don't make everybody else try to walk into your convictions too. That's just not realistic. It is actually more a sign of spiritual immaturity than anything. There's a number of reasons why I don't really feel like reading fantasy is evil or immoral, whether you're a Christian or not. First off, it's fake. It's fake. It's like the Power Rangers. It's not really reflective of the real world that we live in. And even when it has overlap, like for instance Harry Potter has witches and stuff, it's not how witches are in the real world. So a lot of times when I'm talking to these people, it seems like they think that this is really how spells are, and all these different things, and they're not able to really distinguish between real and fake. And they kind of make everything a sin. And for that, I feel like that's more something they got to work through than something that I got to work through. I mean, I'm confident in my own salvation and my Christianity. I'm confident in the things that God says in His Word, and I don't really feel like I have to live under somebody else's convictions to be a good Christian, or be good anything. Next up, and I feel like people don't talk about this too much, but you don't have to agree with everything in a story. I'll go a step further. You don't have to agree with everything that the author of the story believes. Like, there's this idea now that we have to cancel everything, and we can only read a story if we perfectly align ourselves with the author. Like, what kind of nonsense is this? Do you know how many authors I completely agree with? There's like none. None. So which issues are big issues? Does that mean that Christians can't read non-Christian books? Does that mean that non-Christians can't read Christian books? Like, how far are you going to push that? It doesn't really make sense. And you don't have to agree with everything in the story. Things can happen in the story that you don't like. Okay? Like, for instance, in the Bible, where it has a seance. That doesn't mean that you have to think seances are okay. You can read a story and even learn from the story and still not have to agree with everything in the story. Okay? The Bible also records Satan talking. Does that mean I have to believe everything that Satan says? Like, there's just a lot of times where people don't use their whole brain in these kinds of conversations. Rather, they just get kind of one-sided, dogmatic, and very gung-ho about it. They get very enthusiastic, but they don't really have a whole lot of, like, substance to their enthusiasm, so it just doesn't really seem to go anywhere. You also don't have to believe everything you read. You can read something and say, that was interesting, and then move on with your life. Like, I have never once read Lord of the Rings and thought, yes, there are actually Maiar in the real world, and, all these different things, giant eagles and Gandalf the wizard. No, it's just a story. Like, you can just be entertained and move on with your life. I'll do you one further. C.S. Lewis is pretty much well known in the Christian community. I do not agree with all of his theology. There's a lot of theology actually that I disagree with him on. And I still read his books and I find them interesting, and they do cause me to think. And I also read Chronicles of Narnia. Like, how far do you want to push that where it's evil? And I feel like sometimes people just, what they mean is, it's evil because I don't like it. And I feel like that's something that not just religious people do. I feel like everybody kind of does that. It's interesting to me that people hold fantasy to a standard that not even the Bible itself lives up to. And, the Bible will contain some really graphic content, and yet we have more rules than God himself. I mean, think about that time in Game of Thrones where the guy rapes his sister, and then that one girl drives a tent peg through that guy's head. Oh wait, no, that was from the Bible. See what I mean? And so these things, they're evil and wrong when Game of Thrones does it, but then when the Bible does it, it's okay. And it's like that doesn't make sense. Now, I will say sometimes fantasy is too graphic, and that's something you have to find your own line of where it is. And I would say definitely be careful with what you allow in your life, absolutely, and all that. But I don't feel like that inherently makes fantasy evil, and I also don't feel like it's necessarily wrong for everybody to stay away from certain books. You know what I mean? Like, if you came out of Satanism and you're like, oh, Harry Potter, well, then don't read Harry Potter. But that doesn't mean that everybody else has to live by that conviction too. Like, you see people do this. Well, I used to do this, and so I know. So that makes you the authority, and you speak for everybody. Like, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I feel like people need to do more critical thinking about these kinds of issues because I don't feel like they are issues. And then the last thing I want to say about this is a lot of times in fantasy, and I feel like this is something that religious people miss, is a lot of times in fantasy they'll use the same words but have a different meaning for them. A great example of this would be, like, for instance, in the Chronicles of the Black Company, it'll talk about gods, but they aren't really gods. They're more like powerful beings who have, lived for a long time. Well, if you're a Bible-believing Christian, you already know that's not the definition of what makes something God. So then you get to these kinds of conversations and they become super irrational, where people are just like, hey, fantasy is evil. And it's like, why? Because they have other gods in them. Okay? And the Bible also mentions other gods. What's your point? Yeah, but it says not to worship them. And these ones don't say not to worship them. Yes, because it's not an instructional book, it's a fantasy book to entertain. And it's using different words to help us understand what the story is really about. So with all this being said, I really feel like there's a lot that's made from a little. I feel like there's a bunch of anthills that are being made into mountains. And I feel like, stuff like this, where I will continue to read fantasy, and I will continue to get people mad at me for reading fantasy, and they're just going to have to deal with it, because I'm not going to stop. I don't feel any reason to stop. I don't feel any conviction from God to stop. I don't see any biblical warrant to stop. And so I'm going to read fantasy, and if you don't want to read fantasy, that's fine. I'm not going to try to convince you that it's okay. The whole point of this conversation is for me to say, hey, I don't think that it's wrong. I'm going to continue to do it. But if you don't, what do you think? Share in the comments below. Do you think fantasy is evil, or are there some books that you just don't feel comfortable reading? Or a third question, have you ever been in that kind of religious context where people are trying to make you feel like it's a sin for you to enjoy the fantasy? I'd love to hear what you have to say.